Thank you for participating in the 9th Annual BlackStar Film Festival. We would like to thank our funders and individual donors, as well as our network of producing and community partners. This panel is supported in part by Media Justice. The runtime for this panel is 60 minutes, including audience Q&A, so please leave your questions in the comments and we'll do our best to engage them. Please follow us on all social media platforms at BlackStarFest and use the hashtags BSFF20 and BlackStar20 SoLit. We hope you have a wonderful time during the 2020 BlackStar Film Festival.
And welcome everyone to Culture Work in the Wake, a conversation that we are having here at the BlackStar Film Festival. So excited to be in conversation with cultural workers who are thinking deeply about the ways in which we engage each other in the wake. And for those who aren't familiar with Christina Sharp's work, sort of in the wake implies post something, like what has happened. And oftentimes for us, it's in her book in relationship to enslavement or the ship, but we know that when we are in the wake of so many things right now, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a lot of that has going on, that has changed the cultural fabric of the world we live in. And so we're really excited that you are joining us for this conversation. My name is Sage Crump. I'm a culture strategist, and I'm excited to be moderating this beautiful panel. Um, the way we're going to move through our time together is we're going to have an opportunity for these brilliant minds to share with you some things that they feel it's important for you to know as we get into this conversation. Each presenter will have about 5 minutes, and then we'll do some conversation on the back end. So if you're like me, I'm going to advise you to grab a pen, grab a piece of paper so that you can take notes for yourself and track the conversations. And what I am already excited about is the intersections amongst the people on this panel. We have artists, we have folks who are creating spaces, we have sociologists, we have folks who think deeply about how we care for each other, we have professors, we have a wide range of folks who are approaching this conversation of culture work in the wake. And I like to say, as a culture strategist, sometimes culture can be truncated to art and culture production, like what are we making? But I want to encourage us in this conversation to really lean into what we mean when we say culture. I like to say big C culture. And it's how we are together with each other. It is the complex systems that govern the interactions of not just who we are with each other as humans, but how we interact with the natural world and everything around us. And so really excited to engage this panel under the understanding of cultural workers and cultural work in the wake. Thank you for joining us. Our first presenter, who's going to share with us, is Iyabo Kwayana. I tried. I think, and who's a professor, and I will have Iyabo, if you'll join us and get us started. I greatly appreciate it.
Great. My name is Iyabo Kwayana. I'm an auntie, a godmother, an energy worker, a filmmaker, and an educator. And I'm coming to you from the Northeast on Abenaki land. And I come to you as the embodiment of many invisible and visible networks that support me and therefore support all of us in the most subtle and profound ways. And I also want to call on the wisdom of those who came before so that we can have a truly revelatory meeting, be they creepy, crawly things, mammals, people, ancestors, all of those energies that have walked this earth and have wisdom to share with us. So today we are asked to think about the current climate and the question of deep foundational fractures that are finally coming to the surface and fissuring during this time. And perhaps what that means for us as people, practitioners, scholars, in the midst of an ever-changing world. Like many, I believe that filmmaking and media making is a way of channeling a higher intelligence, and that intelligence knows what it's doing as it works through us. And it's in the atmosphere, awaiting a ready hand. And if we let it, it can bring us sometimes beautiful and sometimes painful revelations. But in either case, the higher intelligence is always conspiring on behalf of our good. This is a concept that comes to us also from Haitian cosmology, or should I say, there is a concept that comes to us from Haitian cosmology that I think can be useful in describing the activity of things hidden coming to the surface. And that is the sacred mirror at the crossroads. And this idea of the mirror at the crossroads and the trickster figure whose main domain is the crossroads, I think describes one of the ways in which the activity of things hidden coming to the surface is part of an ancient liberatory technology that is profoundly working in service of the underdog. So there's an essential exchange that happens at the crossroads that really speaks to its liberatory nature. The crossroads are an intersubjective space where all who meet there are bound together through the symbiotic connection of their shadows, and where the sacred mirror becomes a subversive catalyst where the unreconciled and unconscious can come to the surface. So if we consider the idea of the sacred mirror and the crossroads and connect it to this magical apparatus of the camera, we can begin to understand the way in which camera and other forms of technology can be used to illuminate what is under the surface, calling attention to what is hidden, bringing it into the public realm, and disrupting old and entrenched symbolic orders and paradigms and narratives of understanding. The operative word, of course, is can be used, as we know all too well that these same structures can be used to reinforce old narratives and paradigms. So if we look at the countless cases in which everyday people have used their cell phones to record and draw attention to injustices of the past and present, we can see that they are acting in the spirit of a pre-existing form of technology that already has captured the unresolved and heavy shadows that exist within humanity. The haunting video of George Floyd, and there's that countless others that sparked a revolution, joined together with this peculiar corona moment, reflects that what is already acknowledged in folklore, which says that individuals cannot get away with or conceal anything because the past, the present, and the future are captured and recorded at the crossroads through the sacred activity of the sacred mirror at the crossroads. And I have to say, I have to invoke BlackStar Film Festival here, my favorite film festival, because these days I've been watching all of the programming and I'm becoming increasingly more aware that filmmakers are aware of their metaphysical agency as filmmakers and media makers. As they wield new imagery through space and onto our screens, we are healed, transported, transfixed, and transfigured. And I just want to say, finally, in my own work, I am beginning to discover more about what this metaphysical agency means when the gaze is turned inward. And I believe that as filmmaking is always a space that brings about intersubjectivity, that the more we invite our own subjectivities into the crafting process, the more these experiences that we craft invite collective liberation.
Thank you so much, Iyabo. I've already got a half a page just getting started, so I appreciate that. Mark Gonzalez, Mark, will you jump in and share with us your thoughts on this topic?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Mark Gonzalez, born and raised in Alaska nearly 45 years ago, 45 on September 2nd. I know we're all reaching Virgo season for those of us in that world. Currently calling from the coastal city of Sousse in the Medina, in the country called Tunisia in North Africa, where I live with my family and my little ones. In terms of what I do, I think the easiest way is to think about it through the lens of I am part of a team that architects belonging and looks at ways to scale empathy. And the ways we do that is one, by helping the world acknowledge that everything that they know and live is going to change. And that's just a given at this moment. As we were saying earlier on a different call with earlier today, is that 40% of all jobs will be lost to automation within the next 10 to 15 years. That's been the statistics for about 3 years straight. COVID accelerated that 10 to 15 years to perhaps to 10 to 15 weeks. We know in 2030 that the world will reach a point of climate change, which may become irreversible. We know at 2040 that 75% of the Earth's population will move to the urban corridor. And we know at 2050 is when the world needs to sign on to and reach the Sustainable Development Goals if economy and ecology are to find any sort of sense of balance to one another. So from a kind of wake, big picture view, if you will, there are a bunch of wakes coming. And we can deny them, or we can try to situate ourselves with resources, tools, and communities about how we want to meet them, what types of boats we want to be on when riding in the wake, whether they're small boats, life boats, or whether we need an ark, if you will. And so I just think about the world through that lens, and then I try to build things that will be useful to reaching that future shore, if you will. One question to give you a quick insight, a question that was asked earlier in the day was about how does being a father shape the work that I do? And I remember when my oldest daughter, who's now 6, was born, at about 6 weeks, I had to leave the country to go do some work with the UN, and we were having a conversation with diaspora journalists who were really looking at their role in resolving identity conflicts in different zones of the world. And they were like, you're a newborn father, what do you feel? And we were just talking about all the emotions in the heart and all the things that are going through and all the insecurities of like, I'm not prepared for this, nobody signed me up, where's my manual? And as we went through that, they said, well, what do you think is your role as a father? And I said, well, you know what I think is that I think it's natural whenever you're in a state of uncertainty or panic, or in this sense of this conversation, awake, that you want to hyper control what's in front of you. As individuals, we look at uncertainty and we try to build up walls emotionally. As nations, people try to build up walls physically. As family units, whatever the internal dynamic or demographic makeup is, we often try to build up our bank accounts. And so it's interesting that our reaction to lack of control is hyper control. When parents know that's exactly the opposite what a growing human being needs, is that they don't need control. They need exploration, agency, and support. And so I think of that from a behavioral perspective ways, and a lot of the movements that I've been attached to and a lot of the initiatives that we're connected to, which is how do we actually develop and scale that? Spaces for human beings to explore and have the agency to explore and the resources to support and transforming their environment, whether from a block neighborhood or from a regional perspective. And I'll pause there because I want to hear the rest of the brilliant people.
There'll be more time. Even as moderator, I'm writing questions, but if you wind up having questions of each other, there's going to be time and interest for that too. I hope I've already got a few about how we're thinking about time and time travel and inside this conversation. Mia Birdsong, I'm so excited to invite you into this conversation. How are you today, Mia?
Hi, I am actually well today. Thank you for asking, Sage. I'm Mia Birdsong. I am a storyteller, a space holder, a carrier, And I am coming to you from Chochenya Ohlone land, also known as Oakland, California, where our air is full of smoke. A lot of us are grieving right now what that smoke means for us, and our tree elders. A lot of the work that I do is about reclaiming our whole humanity by pushing back against the idea that productivity is moral and that our participation in the labor market is what confers our personhood. This is what America socializes us to believe. It's what capitalism socializes us to believe. It conspires with shame and fear, these very old protective systems that exist in us, to tell us to ignore our full humanity, to not listen to our bodies or our hearts or our loved ones. There was this period when, after sheltering in place started, there was this brief slowness. There was this brief pause in all of the productivity. Not for everyone, but for many of us. And it gave a lot of us this imperfect but illuminating window into what it might look like if we contributed our time toward deepening our connections with loved ones and neighbors, toward caring with others, toward becoming better acquainted with ourselves, right? As Iyabo was talking about, kind of the metaphysical gaze turned inward. It allowed us to listen. The birds seem louder, so we're listening to the birds more. Toward just being. I'm part of this collective of Black women who have been gathering monthly for 4 years. And much of our focus and reason for being has been about reclaiming our whole humanity. It's been about figuring out what our collective liberation really looks like, so we can be free Black women now as we are doing the work of creating liberation for all of us. And before sheltering in place, we would meet once a month in person. And then when sheltering in place started, we began gathering twice a month virtually. Initially, a lot of the increase in time together was meant to create space for us to process and care for each other through all of the uncertainty and fear and anxiety we were experiencing. But very quickly, our focus shifted to rest. We talked about why we need it, what we need to let go of to have it, what we need to claim to have it, what a culture of rest might be. And we practiced rest. A couple of gatherings ago, Millicent, one of the women in this collective, facilitated. And beforehand, she let us know that we should all be in a really comfortable place. She encouraged us to be in our beds. And at the end, she facilitated us through a guided meditation on rest. And most of us fell asleep, including myself. And, I could kind of hear her in I was half asleep, dreaming state, and I could kind of hear her. And afterward, as we kind of talked about it, and then the days that followed, I realized that that couldn't have happened if we'd been gathering in person, right? We gather in person at my house, we're not all going to fall out and take a nap. So, one, it was extraordinary to be napping with a group of Black women. There was something deeply profound about that. But I also recognized that this pandemic opened an opportunity for us to do something that we couldn't have done before, or that we wouldn't have done before. And the circumstances of the pandemic created context for us to be able to sleep together. And I'm saying that I'm telling this story because I think that, we are straddling the world that we live in and all that it beckons us to pay attention to. We got, like, some of it's necessary. We got to make money so we can pay mortgage and, or rent and feed ourselves and feed our families. Some of it's very necessary. Some of it's temporary, right? We're not actually going to be sheltering in place for our entire lifetimes. And some of it's distraction. So there's this piece, the world we live in. But there's also this generational work of walking a path toward the future that we want and need. And these little pieces of culture and practice that emerge more deeply or are illuminated in new ways because of the circumstances of pandemic allow us to see in ways we didn't before. Right? This brief stillness we had made birds and bees and trees louder. And it allowed me to remember that not only are the eucalyptus and the redwoods my relations, but many of them are my elders. And our elders, especially the ones who have lived for generations, have so much to teach us. And our ability as humans to listen to them is something I find that this space is opening up, right? I don't know how many of you have either like houseplants or pets. I'm also a beekeeper, and my dogs and my houseplants and bees have taught me to hear and understand what species other than my own are communicating, right? I know when my dog is hungry or scared or wants affection, not because it says, Mia, can I have a hug? Or would you make me some breakfast? But because they communicate with us. I know when my houseplants need water or fertilizer. I know when my hands are inside of a beehive, whether the hive is content or agitated. And we can learn to hear the flycatchers and the oaks and the sticky monkey flowers as we straddle this world. And I think that I'm trying to hold on to that stillness that we had and not be swept up in the wake of the hurry on, get shit done, demonstrate my value as a human being by making more. I'm trying to sit in the friction of that place, the world that we're in, and the one that we want. Trying to remember who we are, interconnected and part of the earth, because we are nature. I was in a church. My friend Mac started a church. Sage sometimes goes to that church. And we were asked during a meditation to think of our favorite body of water. And for the first time, it occurred to me, I'm a body of water. I am my favorite body of water. And the salt water in me is the same as the salt water in the ocean. We are nature. And I'm trying to stand in the arc of my ancestors and descendants, and move forward, guided by an inheritance of faith. It's one of the inheritances that our ancestors gave us, is faith. That is not always going to be as shitty as it feels and as shitty as it is. I want to leave you with a quote. Pema Chandran said this. She wrote this in a book that I've read, and I can't remember the title of, but she said, as human beings, not only do we seek resolution, but we also feel that we deserve resolution. However, not only not deserve resolution, we don't deserve resolution. And when I think about what she means by resolution, I think about like certainty, clarity, right? Like groundedness. She says we deserve something better than that. We deserve our birthright, which is the middle way, an open state of mind that can relax with paradox and ambiguity. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mia. And I appreciate that quote. I believe in quotes. I believe in quoting often. And so thank you for leaving us with that. And I'd like to pass it to Ruha Benjamin. Ruha,
Hi,
culture work
everyone.
in. So excited. Yeah.
Awesome. That was just so beautiful. All three of those reflections are just washing over me. So again, my name is Ruha, and I'm connecting to all of you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people here in central New Jersey. And I'm just really honored to be in this conversation with all of you. I'm going to return us back to the profound work of Christina Sharp and her incredible book, In the Wake, in which she describes the weather as the total climate. And the climate, she says, is anti-Black. So if COVID, we can think of as a kind of terrible, terrible storm, there's a much broader, much older, much more pernicious environment in which this storm rages. Weathering is also a public health concept that describes the way that social stressors and oppressors get under our skin, into our bloodstream, burdening our organs, overloading our systems, and wearing us down over time. Weathering is one way of explaining the often devastating yet preventable health outcomes that are the result of living day in and out in an anti-Black environment. Weathering helps explain why so many of our loved ones drop dead suddenly before their time, aka racism-related vigilance, otherwise known as putting on a shield or a mask, has a long been a strategy of survival for Black folks well before this pandemic. But with the storm of COVID converging with the weather of anti-Blackness, we find ourselves in a bind. As Ohio resident Aaron Thomas tweeted back in April, I don't feel safe wearing a handkerchief or something else that isn't clearly a protective mask covering my face to the store because I am a Black man living in this world. I want to stay alive, but I also want to stay alive. Staying alive, but also staying alive expresses this longing to survive a biological threat and the multiple social threats that make it hard to rest. Going back to Mia's profound reflection. In fact, soon after Aaron's tweet, 2 Black men wearing hospital masks recorded themselves being followed around and kicked out of a Walmart by an officer. Meanwhile, a Black man was dragged off of a Philadelphia bus by 4 officers for allegedly not wearing a mask. The mask in all these cases was never the issue. Covered or exposed, it was always Blackness. Pathologizing Blackness explains why the first person in Britain to be arrested under the Coronavirus Act was a Black woman, Maria Deneu. Pathologizing Blackness explains why a Black doctor in Miami who was on the front lines testing the homeless for the virus was arrested in front of his own house for allegedly not showing an ID. Pathologizing Blackness also explains why the US Surgeon General could tell Black and Latinx people to, quote, stop drinking and smoking to protect ourselves against the virus instead of focusing on the real causes of vulnerability in work, in housing, in healthcare. Pathologizing Blackness, lest we forget, is profitable. It produces a population of people who can be experimented upon and then disposed of, as when French doctors had the audacity to suggest on live TV that a coronavirus vaccine should be tested on Africans because they are, quote, highly exposed and don't protect themselves. Fortunately, in the age of social media, this particular form of anti-Blackness was swiftly refuted by people around the world, almost as it was happening, by those who insisted that Africa is not a laboratory and Black people are not guinea pigs. So what exactly is the hostile weather that preceded COVID? Yes, policing is part of it, but also the deadly policies killing us softly. Ours is a society with health policies that neglect the sick, education policies that breed ignorance, labor policies that produce disposable people, housing policies that manufacture scarcity, and environmental policies that ensure our extinction by design. Cultural work in this hostile context is about confronting the corrosive individualism that infects every area of our lives and work against the revolting distortion of freedom talk. The freedom to work without sick leave, the freedom to nurse the ailing without personal protective equipment, the freedom to grow the nation's food with the looming threat of ICE raids, the freedom to be warehoused in prisons with no way to socially distance, the freedom to be stranded in nursing homes with no way to avoid contagion, freedom not to care as the most vulnerable die off. The aim of this deadly strain of freedom, a freedom from mutual obligation, is to break society, to erode mutuality, to grind down our ability to care for one another, to eat away at any notion of a collective good, and to destroy the institutions upon which society depends. The fact is, ours has never stopped being a eugenically structured society designed for the fittest to flourish and the vulnerable to die off. This destructive ideology was alive and kicking well before the pandemic, and it's being revived now to reconsolidate power and privilege in the wake of this global crisis. Cultural work in the wake requires us to understand that racism is productive, not in the sense of being good, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. Many of us are still taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple in the backwoods and outdated, rather than as innovative, systemic, diffuse, an attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, forward-looking, even viral. In the context of the pandemic, we know who racism harms, but who does it benefit? What is it producing? If we only look at the underside, we miss seeing who racism is enriching, whose lives is it extending. As the poet M. Norbisi Philip put it, if we were truly in this together, we would not be in this together. This reality, however, is not inevitable, rather the outcome of choices that people and institutions make to invest in some things and not others, to seed some values and not others. Together, we can and must insist on radically different values and investments as part of the cultural work we're all responsible for. So if this virus is teaching us anything, it is that something almost undetectable can be deadly, and that we can transmit it without knowing. So doesn't this imply that small things, seemingly minor actions, decisions, and habits could have exponential effects in the other direction, affirming life, fostering well-being, and invigorating society? In the end, I'm a student of the late, great Octavia E. Butler. As many of you know, Butler's novel Parable of the Sower, originally published in 1993, begins in the year 2025 in a gated community just outside of Los Angeles, where the weather is even more wretched and run down than ours today. Environmental degradation, economic collapse, massive wealth inequality, conflict and violence of every imaginable kind, just a few clicks from where we are now. And when Butler was asked, so what do we do, by a student when she was giving a talk, she responded, I mean, there's no single answer that will resolve all our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers, at least. You can be one of them if you choose to be. So I'll leave us with this thought. we can be one of them if we choose to be. Vectors of justice, spreaders of joy, transforming our ecosystem so that everyone has a chance to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. Greatly appreciate that. That was beautiful. As a student of Octavia Butler and emergent strategy, I'm so into it. So many questions, and the relationship between that and what it means to be at the crossroads is going to be such a rich one coming. Cecilia Aldondo is our final presenter for today, and so I'm going to pass it to you, Cecilia.
Thank you all. Thank you for all these beautiful thoughts. I'm going to start by introducing a clip to a film that just screened yesterday as part of this incredible film festival. First, I want to say I am in the land of the Mohican and Haudenosaunee people in Catskill, New York, which is unceded land. This film, Landfall, explores, I think, a lot of themes that are analogous to what we're discussing here. It's a film about the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which, for those of you that don't know, is a cataclysmic event that has had catastrophic aftermath for Puerto Rico. But I think for me as a filmmaker, one of the things that drove me to make the film as a diasporic Puerto Rican who has really been animated by grief and rage at looking at what has happened to my homeland, I was really keen to make a film not only about the aftermath of a catastrophic event, but a film that really explored what we might think of as like the pre-existing conditions that catastrophic disasters can exacerbate. So in Puerto Rico's case, an odious and illegal debt that most Puerto Ricanos had no hand in creating and have been paying since before Hurricane Maria, and which really unleashed a series of predatory acts of disaster capitalism meant to decimate the already fragile infrastructure in Puerto Rico. And that really set the stage for the perfect storm, if you will. And so it's a film that is very much about a sort of long arc of time, both really looking very far back, as far as 500 years, and thinking about this as a colonial condition, but also looking at the now and really thinking about the small quotidian moments that mark the aftermath, or I think maybe an analogous word might be the wake of the moment. So I'm going to show a clip from the film that is really just one of these moments of a group of young people sitting around and discussing the how they feel in the wake of Maria.
Qué rico es comer rico, ¿verdad? Una sensación bien diferente cada vez. La verdad es que a veces uno come y no es rico. Sí, sí. ¿Sabes? Pues comí, pues voy a comérmelo porque hay hambre.
Sobre todo cuando vives solo. Que puedes comer pan con huevo de desayuno, de almuerzo y de cena. Sí. Por 3 meses. Y te regalan un asopado y lo extienden por 2 días. Pues, o tres.
Le echas agua.
Exacto.
Y con 3 fideitos.
Exacto.
Se fue tanto de una en el proceso y con el huracán que de momento volver a recuperarlo, primero porque estás en el ajoro, después porque sientes que ya se te ha ido toda la energía y el proceso de volver a recuperarla es bien cansón. Yo pienso que después que uno sobrevive María, uno sobrevive cualquier otra cosa que pueda pasar en este país.
O sea, es que es bien loco porque la sensación ha sido como no hay tiempo para pensar. ¿Por qué? Porque tienes que recuperar tu trabajo de alguna forma, porque tienes que volver a poner tu apartamento en condiciones de alguna forma, porque ya no tienes chavo para el mes que viene, o sea que tienes que pensar qué vas a hacer para poder comer el mes que viene, tienes que pensar en que si tu familia está bien, que todos los trabajos que se empezaron a hacerle, ¿verdad?, de reconstrucción, en qué proyectos te querías meter a ayudar, que yo creo que no ha habido una pausa. Y eso es del huracán, ¿verdad? Y algunos de ustedes lo han mencionado ya, eso se le suma el vacilón político que hay en esta isla, que es como si ellos no hubieran sufrido nada porque 2 semanas después del huracán ya están anunciando los recortes que van a haber en el próximo presupuesto. Y es como, pero ¿cómo es posible que estamos hablando de recortes en presupuesto a 2 semanas del huracán cuando todavía la gente no tiene luz ni agua? Sí. O sea, que entonces como eso se le trepa a lo próximo y a lo próximo, y cuando tú vienes a ver, no ha habido un tiempo. O sea, no ha habido un espacio de en realidad sentarse y reflexionar dónde estamos parados, cuáles son los próximos pasos, qué podemos hacer para el bienestar de todos los que estamos sufriéndolo. O sea, eso no lo ha habido.
Thank you so much for sharing that clip, Cecilia. Is there anything you'd like to talk a little bit more about it?
Sure, if there's a moment. I think one of the things I think about is this metaphor of the wake. I think one of the questions I have is that, how do you manage to find yourself in the wake of something when there are always new destabilizations to kind of come and say new sweeping currents, new riptides. And I think in the case of Puerto Rico, that I think we can see in the case of the pandemic of racism in this country, the pandemic of COVID, I think part of what we're seeing right now is this set of compounding and ever compounding crises. And so one of the things that I attempt to do with the film is to take stock of that sense that, how do you mark after? How do you conceive of an after when the crisis continues to repeat and continues to compound? And at the same time, how do we make space to mark the incredible and beautiful and gorgeous ways that people care for one another, love one another, dance together, have sex, have parties, have moments of extraordinary community. And so I think for me right now, that is, I think, something that I want to make space for in this conversation of these massive structural issues. How do we think about this from a state of deep, ingrained, emotional, microcosmic community? So I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Because that was actually a really great setup. Because one of the things I'm sitting with, listening to all of you all, and so much gratitude. We could actually just shut this down right now and just be like, it's amazing. What I'm present to is there's a journey, and then there's a moment that is the wait, right? Like that we're talking about both of these. So within the comments that you all have shared, we've gone from pre-wake, which is where Mark took us, to the crossroads, where Iyabo was and what gets reflected there, to the relationship between what is systemic and historical and what is in the moment and how do we care for ourselves, between Ruha and Mia, and then the effort of survival is what came out for me. And I think my home is New Orleans, Louisiana, which is, we're coming on the anniversary of Katrina. Like, so the effort of survival when I was watching that clip was really present to me. And I think there's a way cultural work helps us both hold the journey, the whole, and also gives us an opportunity to drop deeply into a section of it to say, how do we then figure out how to be together? How do we address each other in a way that impacts our intimate relationships and the systems of anti-Blackness, systems of healthcare that are all happening at the same time. So my question then for you all is, in the midst of this journey, what is getting reflected in this moment that feels like a cultural space? I talk about this time as a global cultural disruption. It is like the ways in which even thinking about the ways in which we even bury our dead is considered dangerous or deadly, right? Like, what does it mean to not be able to do that, or to even criminalize people for wanting to do that, right? So in the midst of this global disruption, what is getting reflected that gives us an image of what is next? And when I say next, I don't mean to be ahistorical, but I do mean to think about how do we become a nexus for the culture that is coming. Like, how are we intentional and intentionally adapting for the culture that is coming? And I'm gonna actually ask Mia to start us off, because there's, when you said and I want to, because what I'm holding very much in this moment is the grief and the opportunity of the moment, right? Uh, that, and you mentioned it quickly around what's happening in Brooklyn, but I think that's very present for a lot of us who are thinking about how culture is shaped.
Well, I think so much of it is about that in the face of tragedy and struggle, there are these things that we insist upon as people. We insist upon being together in some way, right? Like, if we can't be together physically, we will be together virtually. We still show up and care for each other. We still seek to be in relationship with each other. And that tells me, right, that thing, that insistence tells me that that is one of those things that is going to carry us forward through everything. And that's part of what I'm wanting to look for. Like, that's part of my question that I'm trying to live into, is what are the things that do feel certain despite the uncertainty? What are the things that ground us, right? I think about the longevity of their trees that have existed for hundreds of years, or mountain ranges that have existed of years, and we are in relationship with those things. And there is a way in which many of us are called into deeper relationship when the trauma's happening, when I said to my kids, if there'd been an earthquake, this is part of what I feel like you were talking about, Cecilia. Like, if there'd been an earthquake, it could have been devastating, but then we'd be in recovery, right? And right now we're in this extended period of earthquake, of just the ground shaking beneath us all the time. But there are these threads that are pulling us through, and I feel like those are the things that I'm trying to follow.
Thank you. Other folks who would like to step into this idea of, in this moment, in this wake, in this space, if we go deep into this moment, what do we see as more possible?
I'll jump in. So, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is our relationship to our own mortality and vulnerability, and the kinds of community work that relates to, and relationship building. So when I was in my 20s, I lived with my family in Northern California. And so there was one day when I heard my younger son, he was howling, running towards the apartment, and his face, tears streaming, blood was spraying from his chin and neck. And through all the fluids, I could see there was a deep gash underneath his chin, almost to the bone, that was shaped like a smile. And it turns out that he and his older brother were riding their bikes in circles around the courtyard, and he lost control and went headfirst into the pavement. So at that time, I didn't have any insurance, and I was just making enough through campus jobs to cover rent and food. So we didn't go to the ER for stitches. So for over a week, we watched and we waited. We dressed the wound, redressed it, hoping that it would close on its own before it got infected. So fortunately, he turned out to be an overhealer. So not only did his bloody smile close within days, but this huge keloid, bubbled over it as reinforcement. And I was always joking, oh, it's like watching a spell from Harry Potter. And so my lighthearted humor concealed the kind of anger and helplessness and vulnerability that I felt at that moment, to weigh my child's well-being against the cost of a hospital visit. So I'm thinking now about the healthcare, the devastation of our people are experiencing in terms of our healthcare, and specifically this kind of metaphor of thick skin. that keloid that grew over, because thick skin, it turns out, is one of the many racist stereotypes that underwrite medical racism. Black patients are routinely undertreated, in part because health professionals believe that we feel less pain. There was a study in 2016, the University of Virginia, where they were surveying medical students who, when they were sampled, they had a range of false beliefs, including the idea that Black people age more slowly, our nerve endings are less sensitive, our blood coagulates more quickly, and that our skin is thicker than whites. So these students, not surprisingly, they also held erroneous ideas that underestimated the pain of Black patients in these mock medical cases. So there was a writer recently that was talking about this particular strain of medical racism, and she says that the idea of Black immunity to pain is purely magical thinking that's rooted in long-standing, widely circulated, and scientifically baseless beliefs that essentially cast Black people as something other than human. Magical, like my own allusions to Harry Potter in that moment when I was looking at my son's quick healing. So this idea of Black superhumanity, even when it's an expression of maternal love, I think is tied to subhuman treatment. Our own magical thinking that's born out of economic precarity that may seem harmless, actually, that stereotype of Black stoicism in the face of pain is institutionalized and widely held throughout the medical system. And it justifies the rationing of care on a massive scale. So I'll end by just saying that, this idea of growing thick skin, it's something that we may need to do individually as a kind of protective force when it's us against the world. But what does it mean when we have a community around us, whether it's a pod or some other kind of community that can be a buffer where we can have thin skin, where we can be vulnerable, where we can shed the layers and the kind of bulwark that we need, the mask that we need. And so part of the thing I think that's really beautiful and coming to light is how, going back to Mia's example of her community of sisters, is that people have become so much more intentional and deliberate of creating these pods and these communities as this kind of, acorn, going back to Butler, so that we can have a place to let our guards down, to take our masks off, to have thin skin. And I hope that it's not just of the moment. I hope that this is something that we sustain as part of the larger cultural shift that we're in.
Thank you.
Can I add something that
Please.
came to me? Something that Ruha, you're talking about, makes me think about how much trouble I have with the word resilience at the moment. It seems to be really quite a popular term, especially to describe communities that are tolerating intolerable circumstances. It often seems to be a really romantic rationalization for things that should never be allowed to happen. And so many people in Puerto Rico are saying, don't call us resilient. Don't call us that. Because it's a way of papering over things that should never be happening. And I also really am thinking about what you're saying about community. And I mean, completely agree. I mean, all I've been doing is rereading Octavia Butler myself. And I think one of the things that I find, in this moment, Puerto Rico just was hit by a tropical storm yesterday, still facing the wind, the rains. Had another storm hit it a few weeks ago. Don't talk to us about what we need to continue putting up with. But on top of that, one of the questions I have is, when do we get to be allowed to be vulnerable publicly, politically? This idea that we have to create, the fact that we even have to create these bubbles of vulnerability and insulate ourselves from forces, that we cannot show our pain and wear it on the outside. Like, that should be our exoskeleton. And I feel like this in all of my predominantly white spaces of work, or, places where I need to kind of show up and look like I have my act together and my game on. And it's such an American idea and a capitalist idea. And I do want to sort of insist, of course, on our freedom to have our private spaces and our own communities. But I also want to say we should be allowed to be vulnerable in public, and people should know why. We shouldn't have to explain what that is. So I just wanted to add that.
Something else that I thought was important, just briefly, is that when you were talking about being with your son in that moment, it made me reflect on how much power we give to institutions as well. Of course, we need to depend on institutions for our healthcare and everything, but then we also need to start coming up with the strategies of how do we care for ourselves and our community. And I think that kind of goes to what Mia was saying. I often, because I haven't had a chance to go or I don't want to go to the hospital right now, and I'm actually sick, I've had to kind of rely on my own resources. And I know that that's a luxury as well, so I'm not saying that, but I think some of those systems that are within culture that harken back to the things that we knew in the past, in past generations, there hasn't been any conversation about the immune system and how to build it within this whole pandemic. There's just no one's talking about exercise, drink water, and I know that this is a pervasive illness that can supersede all of those things too, but I don't want to take any more time, but I just wanted to add that.
No, I appreciate that, because I was in a very similar thinking just around how, and this is my question for you, Mark, what are the experiments that we are practicing? What are we trying that have our vulnerability on the front end, right? That have our practices in front of us, that allow that. I love this quote. I'm an abolitionist, and I love this quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and I'm pretty sure I'm close. I'm not. Don't say it's exact. This is: abolition isn't the absence of anything; it is the presence of systems that are life affirming. Mm. Yeah. And so, in the building of our systems, I'm curious about experiments in systems that are life affirming, experiments in systems that or ways of being that our vulnerability is on, our hearts are on the outside, right?
Well, this is what we do, right? I mean, I think that this is that paradox, that what we want is to have a culture in which we can be whole human beings, where we can be seen as regular ass human beings. We don't have to be super people, right? But it's dangerous to do that. It's dangerous for us to be vulnerable in public right now. So we have to practice. We have to create our own systems with our own communities, whether that's our pods, our bubbles, whatever that is, so that we can practice what that is. Because the way that we get to the thing that we want is by practicing it now. So I feel like we're modeling, right, the creation of systems that we want. I mean, I think about all of the mutual aid networks that they existed before, but they went into hyperdrive right when the pandemic started. I'm like, they're modeling what healthcare, what's possible, right? We should not have to do that. Our government absolutely should be providing all of us with amazing quality healthcare. But we get to, because they're not doing that, we get to experiment and do the things that we know need to happen right now. We're not going to let people die while we wait for the government to figure it out. We're going to try and figure it out ourselves. And in doing so, we're modeling the kinds of systems that we want.
I just want to add, this is what Puerto Rico did after Maria. I mean, the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, like the aftermath of so many, like Katrina, was a moment of, utter institutional failure. And it was a moment of people helping other people to survive, saving other people's lives. And, it has actually generated really extraordinary moments, I think, and examples of community in all of its richness, culturally, aesthetically, politically, and it's transformed my life. I mean, I grew up outside of Puerto Rico, visiting every year to visit my family, but it's, like many people, diasporic origin, is my convoluted homeland. But it's through making this film and spending so much time with people who are doing precisely that work of mutual aid and community care, that I, recently had the opportunity to move to a farm with my partner, and we are starting a collaborative farming project. It's changed my life, and it's changed my sense that, this isn't going away. This isn't going away, and individualism is not going to do me any good. So, I think part of it also is recognizing that the work we might do in our professional worlds is essentially needs to be done. I mean, this is partly what mutual aid is about too. It's the most microcosmic, down to the earth, cellular kind of work. So yes, I think it's really essential.
Mark, I'm curious. I want to get you into this conversation a little around your experiments in empathy and belonging, and where have you seen that, or where are you seeing that practice, or how are you thinking about those things as part of what it feels to me like a culture in which a culture in which we know at our core the state, the infrastructure, quote unquote, the things that the commons are in some ways being returned to the people, right? Because they have never been functional for us, but we're actually really clear as a body that they are not functional in any way, shape, or form, right? So what are the ways in which through your work around architecting belonging, which I love the phrase, and scaling empathy, are you seeing these experiments in new culture?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of architecting belonging, our family and a group of us actually purchased an 8,000 square foot center in the UNESCO World Heritage Medina of Sousse in North Africa, which was my wife's heritage homeland, with the idea that we have global relationships. And most of us have kids who live and love across borders, but are told to pick one, even though they have 3 passports and speak 4 languages. And those of us who do global work know you're invited places, but you're often not allowed to bring your family. And if you're allowed to bring your loved one, you're not allowed to bring your kids. So we said, what would it mean to buy and build a space that actually had what we call a little dreamers lab attached to it, with 8 boutique residency rooms enabled to host people from across the world to see one another. And to connect with one another, and to do so in ways that is actually a value add to the local community versus just a kind of gated, walled off community in which kind of modern tourism, even within the boutique space, often is created. And so we began doing that, which was like, okay, we've worked for decades in this is not working. What would it mean to actually start pooling resources and collectively say, well, what do we want to build and invest in, and see if we can do that together, knowing there are no guarantees in any of our lives. Most of our communities have never had guarantees for centuries, so at least let's take the guarantees into our own hands in terms of where we want to roll the dice. In terms of empathy, I think there's something really interesting, which is we've spent about the last 2 years mapping the global empathy technology field as we see it, which is what are the practitioners, individuals, and institutions that are trying to deepen their understanding of empathy? What is it? How does it operate? How does it fit within culture, sacred technologies, as well as neurological pathways, if you will? And then what are the systems that scale? Remembering that technology is not digital. Technology is anything that systemizes a process. And as we said earlier and today, the dinner table is the oldest connection technology. Story is the oldest empathy technology in terms of creating a process through which an individual can see themselves as another person. For me, in terms of empathy and how we understand ourselves, is we have a very shallow understanding of empathy. And that's where I really appreciate the colleagues in the deep empathy field, especially from indigenous communities, indigenous tech communities, and some of the behavioral science fields, which is a lot of empathy focuses on the empathy gap or the empathy deficit. It doesn't look at three additional aspects, which is what is empathetic hostility in terms of what makes a person angry to see another person get help. What is empathetic joy, not just showing up for someone when they're in pain, but actually to watch someone celebrate and to celebrate with them. And then what is empathy as a default operating system? Which is actually what a lot of kind of the neuroscience is starting to look at, which is we're hardwired to care for each other, not just those who look like us, but for each other across the gamut. So then when does this other operating system begin placed in our brain? And how do we, instead of going to this idea of we need to cultivate empathy, really go back to the conversation of this is who we are, how do we renew, regenerate, restore, and repair? And then there's some really interesting work around those who are doing it. You can look in New York at the Neurospeculative Afrofeminist Lab. You can look at Stephanie Dinkin's work and around artificial intelligence. You can work at some things, Making Kin with the Machine. It's an amazing article that really looks at indigenous communities' understanding of earth and even non-living matters, as rocks is having rights. And so how does AI fit into that type of cosmology in terms of respect of all things? And how can we then utilize that to build more meaningful devices, if you will? That's how I'm approaching this conversation, which is this is who we are. We're in a moment where 50 years ago, we were able to put a spaceship on the moon. We're in a moment where 10 years ago, we just began to use a device that could do FaceTime conversations with other people on other sides of the planet in real time. And if we're able to create those devices, to just do simple things like conversations, then we should also be able to create them to do simple things like connect with one another, truly.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now we're on a deep science fiction sort of trail because we've had Octavia Butler, and I think about Earthseed Verses and all that you touch, you change, all that you change is you, like change is constant. But also, Mark, now you got me thinking about a beautiful quote from Ursula Le Guin, in which she says, capitalism seems inevitable, but then again, so do the divine rights of kings. Right? We are living inside an imagination of someone else's imagination that hasn't actually existed for this long. White supremacy likes to make us ahistorical and likes to truncate our imagination. And if we can reconnect, remember, understand what's reflected in the mirror at the crossroads and pull these pieces together, I think we have a way forward culturally that does hold us all of our well-being, our humanity, our dignity, and our connection to the living world at its center. So grateful for all of you all today. So incredibly grateful for this time. I just want to say thank you to BlackStar for bringing this together, for bringing this panel together. The brilliant mind, whomever it was, we just deeply appreciate the broadness of a cultural conversation in the wake and what does it mean to be in the time that we're living in. I want to thank our sponsor, Media Justice, that also has us thinking a lot about what does it mean to live inside a culture of surveillance and how do we work our way out of that, right? And we understand what safety is and what safety can feel like. And so grateful for the ways folks are showing up for their individual communities, their most intimate spaces, and as we dismantle our structures. Any last thoughts before we move on, my panelists? My panelists are new friends. Now I'm calling all of you all. Just know that what's happening.
Thank
And
you.
I'd like to add a
everyone.
couple thoughts.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Real quick, I did want to say that I know in this moment where folks are contemplating escape plans or alternative routes, that you have a place in a home here, and that you're always welcome here. I know sometimes we don't reach out and we don't think to ask because we often carry others, but to just everyone here on the conversation, just know you have a place here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you,
As we
Mark.
practice, that's what we want to live into. Everyone, thank you for your time. Thank you for your brilliance. Thank you, BlackStar. Big up the tech team. Thank you all for holding.
Sage.
And everyone, have a beautiful day.
Bye.